The Accidental President. Part 2, The Battle for Abuja, The Rise of a Dictator. Setting, the Presidential Villa, Abuja. Captain Joshua Odum stood in the war room of the Presidential Villa, a place that had quickly become the heart of his operations. The room was filled with maps, tactical displays, and the steady hum of activity as his officers worked tirelessly to coordinate the defense of the capital. The sounds of distant explosions and gunfire still echoed through the walls, a reminder that, although they had successfully repelled the first wave of Kalu's assault, the battle for Abuja was far from over. Joshua had barely slept in the past 48 hours. The strain of command was taking its toll, but he knew there was no time for rest. General Adisa Kalu's forces were regrouping, and it was only a matter of time before they launched another attack. The survival of Nigeria's fragile democracy depended on his ability to hold the line. Colonel Hassan, his second-in-command, stood beside him, reviewing the latest reports from the front. "Mr. President, the situation is critical. Kalu's forces are pulling back, but our intelligence suggests the regrouping for a full-scale assault. They've dug in just outside the city, and they're preparing for a prolonged siege." Joshua nodded, absorbing the information. The reality of the situation was grim. Kalu's troops outnumbered his own, and they were better equipped. While Joshua's forces had the advantage of terrain and the fortifications within the city, they were running dangerously low on supplies. "We need to find a way to break the momentum," Joshua said, his voice firm despite the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. "If they're preparing for a siege, we can't afford to sit and wait. We need to strike at the weakest points, disrupt the supply lines, and force them to rethink the strategy." Hassan glanced at the map, where the positions of Kalu's forces were marked with red. "A direct assault on the positions would be risky, but we could launch targeted strikes against the supply convoys. If we can hit them hard enough, we might be able to slow their advance and buy ourselves some time." Joshua considered the proposal. It was a risky strategy, but they were running out of options. "Do it," he said finally. "Organize small, mobile units to carry out the raids. Hit them fast and pull back before they can retaliate. We need to make them feel the pressure." Hassan nodded and turned to relay the orders. As he left, Joshua leaned over the map, tracing the routes that Kalu's forces would likely use to resupply. Every decision weighed heavily on him. Every move, every counter-move, could determine the fate of the nation. Joshua's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see Lieutenant Adeora, one of his most trusted advisors, entering the room. Her face was lined with worry, but there was also a spark of determination in her eyes. "Joshua," Adeora said, addressing him informally as she often did when they were alone, "we've received word from our contacts in the north. Kalu's forces are pressuring the local villages, trying to turn the people against us. They're spreading propaganda, telling them that we're responsible for the chaos and that Kalu is the only one who can restore order." Joshua frowned. The last thing they needed was to lose the support of the people. Without the help, holding the city would become even more difficult. "What's the mood in the north? Are they buying into Kalu's lies?" "Some are, but many are still loyal to us," Adeora replied. "But that could change if we don't act quickly. We need to show them that we're still in control, that we're the ones who will protect them." Joshua nodded, his mind racing. "We need to secure our connections with the north. If we can maintain the support, we'll have a chance to push back Kalu's forces. But if we lose them..." Adeora didn't need him to finish the sentence. She knew what was at stake. "I'll arrange for more communications with the northern leaders," Adeora said. "We need to keep them informed, let them know what's really happening here. If we can maintain the loyalty, we might be able to turn the tide." Joshua gave her a grateful nod. "Thank you, Adeora. I don't know what I'd do without you." She offered him a small, reassuring smile. "You're doing just fine, Joshua. We're all in this together." As she left the room, Joshua returned his attention to the map. He could feel the weight of leadership pressing down on him, the responsibility of every life that hung in the balance. But he also knew that he couldn't afford to falter. Nigeria needed him to be strong, to make the hard decisions, and to lead them through this crisis. Setting, Kalu's headquarters, outside Abuja. General Adisa Kalu paced the length of his command tent, his mind a whirl of calculations and simmering rage. The initial assault on Abuja had not gone as planned. Joshua Odum had proven more resilient than Kalu had anticipated, and now the general was forced to regroup, to rethink his strategy. Odum is a stubborn fool, Kalu muttered to himself, his voice barely above a growl. But even the strongest walls can be brought down. It's just a matter of time. Kalu's commanders were gathered around the tactical table, awaiting his next orders. They knew better than to speak out of turn, to question the general's decisions. Kalu's temper was as notorious as his ruthlessness, and none of them wished to provoke it. Brigadier General Ibrahim Olatunji, one of Kalu's most trusted officers, stepped forward cautiously. General, our scouts report that Odum's forces are launching hit-and-run attacks on our supply convoys. They're trying to weaken us before we can fully encircle the city. Kalu's eyes narrowed as he absorbed the information. Odum is desperate, he said, more to himself than to Olatunji. He knows he can't win in a straight fight, so he's resorting to guerrilla tactics. But desperation can only take him so far. Olatunji nodded. We're reinforcing our supply lines, but it's slowing down our advance. If we can't get our heavy artillery into position, it'll be difficult to break through the defenses. Kalu clenched his fists, his mind racing with strategies. He had to maintain the upper hand, to keep the pressure on Odum until the captain had no choice but to surrender. But he couldn't afford to let his forces get bogged down in a prolonged siege. He needed to find a way to break Odum's defenses quickly and decisively. Order our artillery units to advance to the front lines, Kalu commanded. I want them to start bombarding the city immediately. We'll soften them up before the next assault. And double the patrols along the supply routes. I want those hit-and-run attacks stopped before they can do any more damage. Olatunji saluted and turned to carry out the orders. Kalu watched him go, his mind already several steps ahead. He knew that time was not on his side. The longer this battle dragged on, the more likely it was that outside forces would intervene. He needed to crush Odum quickly, to reassert his control over the entire country before anyone could challenge him. As Kalu returned to the tactical table, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping out of his grasp. Odum's resilience was proving to be more than just a nuisance, it was becoming a real threat. And threats had to be eliminated. Kalu's thoughts turned to the people of Abuja, the civilians caught in the crossfire of this brutal struggle. They were pawns in his game, tools to be used to achieve his goals. But he also knew that the loyalty could be bought, or forced. If Odum was relying on the support of the people, then Kalu would make sure that support was shattered. Begin broadcasting messages to the city, Kalu ordered one of his communications officers. Tell them that the so-called President Odum is the reason for the suffering. Offer them safety and food if they turn him over to us. We'll break the spirit from within. The officer nodded and moved to relay the command. Kalu's eyes gleamed with cold determination. He would use every weapon at his disposal, psychological, military, and economic, to bring Odum to his knees. Setting, the presidential villa, Abuja. The bombardment began just before dawn. The first shells landed in the outskirts of the city, sending shockwaves through the ground and shattering windows for miles around. The sound was deafening, a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the presidential villa. Captain Joshua Odum was jolted awake by the blasts, his mind snapping into full alertness as he grabbed his gear and rushed to the command center. The scene was chaotic, officers shouting orders, radio operators frantically trying to coordinate with units across the city, and the ever-present sound of explosions rattling the walls. Status report. Joshua barked as he entered the room. Colonel Hassan was already at the tactical table, his face grim as he pointed to the map. Kalu's artillery has started bombarding the city. They're targeting our defensive positions and key infrastructure. We're taking heavy damage, but our defenses are holding for now. The problem is, we can't take this kind of punishment indefinitely. Joshua scanned the map, noting the areas that were under the heaviest bombardment. Kalu was systematically targeting supply depots, communication hubs, and defensive fortifications, anything that could cripple their ability to resist. The artillery strikes were relentless, and the situation was rapidly deteriorating. We need to move our remaining supplies to more secure locations, Joshua ordered. Spread them out so that a single strike won't take out everything. And get the civilians into the safest shelters we have left. We can't afford any more casualties. Colonel Hassan nodded, already barking orders to his subordinates. The command center was a flurry of activity as officers scrambled to carry out Joshua's directives. The tension in the room was palpable, but there was also a sense of grim determination. They had been pushed to the brink before, and they had held the ground. They would do so again. Lieutenant Adeora entered the room, her face pale but resolute. "Joshua, the situation is worse than we thought. Kalu's forces have infiltrated parts of the city. They're using the bombardment as cover to move in on foot, trying to sow chaos and weaken our defenses from within." Joshua's heart sank. Kalu's strategy was brutally effective: soften them up with artillery, then send in troops to exploit the chaos. It was a tactic that could break even the most disciplined forces, and it was clear that Kalu intended to overwhelm them by sheer force. "We can't let them gain a foothold inside the city," Joshua said, his voice hardening. "We'll need to deploy rapid response teams to counter these infiltrators. If they establish a stronghold, we'll lose control of Abuja." Lieutenant Adeora nodded. "I'll coordinate with our units on the ground. We've trained for this, Joshua. We can handle it." Joshua met her gaze, finding strength in her resolve. "I know we can. We don't have a choice." As Adeora moved to organize the countermeasures, Joshua turned his attention back to the map. The situation was dire, but he refused to give in to despair. Kalu had the advantage in numbers and firepower, but Joshua had something that Kalu didn't: the unwavering support of his people and the unyielding determination to defend what was right. "Colonel Hassan," Joshua called out, "I want our artillery units to focus on counter-battery fire. If we can pinpoint the locations of Kalu's artillery, we might be able to take some of them out and reduce the pressure on our defenses." Hassan saluted, already moving to relay the orders. Joshua knew it was a long shot. Kalu's forces were well entrenched, and their artillery was likely spread out to minimize the risk of counterattacks. But they had to try. Every gun they silenced would give them a little more breathing room. The minutes ticked by as the bombardment continued, the ground shaking with each new impact. Joshua could feel the weight of every decision, every life that hung in the balance. But he pushed the doubts aside, focusing on the task at hand. They had come too far to falter now. As the sun rose over the battered city, the first reports started coming in from the front lines. The rapid response teams had engaged the infiltrators, and the fighting was fierce. Kalu's troops were using guerrilla tactics, striking quickly and then melting back into the chaos of the city. But Joshua's forces were holding the ground, pushing back where they could and fortifying the positions where they couldn't. "Sir," a young lieutenant called out, rushing over to Joshua with a radio in hand. "We've just received a transmission from one of our forward scouts. They've located one of Kalu's main artillery positions, an old factory complex on the outskirts of the city. It's heavily defended, but if we can take it out, it could buy us some time." Joshua's mind raced as he weighed the options. Sending a strike force into the heart of enemy territory would be dangerous, but the potential payoff was too great to ignore. If they could neutralize that artillery position, it would give them a much-needed reprieve from the constant bombardment. "Get me Lieutenant Adamu," Joshua ordered, his decision made. "He's the best we have for this kind of operation." The lieutenant quickly handed over the radio, and within moments, Joshua was speaking to Lieutenant Adamu, one of his most experienced and reliable officers. "Lieutenant Adamu, I need you to lead a strike team to take out an enemy artillery position," Joshua said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "It's located in an old factory complex on the outskirts of the city. It's heavily defended, but if we can neutralize it, it could turn the tide in our favor." Adamu's response was immediate and confident. "Understood, sir. We'll move out right away. We won't let you down." Joshua felt a surge of pride and relief. He knew that if anyone could pull off this mission, it was Adamu and his team. But he also knew that the stakes were incredibly high. Failure was not an option. "Good luck, Lieutenant," Joshua said, his voice firm. "And come back in one piece. We're going to need you for the battles to come." As the radio connection ended, Joshua turned his attention back to the command center. There was still so much to do, and the clock was ticking. But for the first time since the bombardment had begun, he felt a glimmer of hope. They were still in the fight, still holding on. And as long as they could keep fighting, there was a chance for victory. Setting: the factory complex, outskirts of Abuja. Lieutenant Adamu moved silently through the rubble-strewn streets, his team close behind him. The city was a war zone, the once bustling neighborhoods reduced to shattered remnants of concrete and steel. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and the only sounds were the distant booms of artillery and the occasional crackle of gunfire. Adamu's team had been handpicked for this mission. Each soldier was a veteran, skilled in urban warfare and guerrilla tactics. They had faced impossible odds before, and they had always come out on top. But this mission was different. The stakes were higher, the risks greater. And yet, there was no hesitation in the movements, no fear in their eyes. They knew what needed to be done. The factory complex loomed ahead, a hulking mass of crumbling walls and rusted machinery. It had been abandoned for years, but now it was a fortress, bristling with Kalu's troops and artillery. The enemy had fortified the entrances, turning the factory into a nearly impenetrable stronghold. Adamu signaled for his team to halt, crouching behind a collapsed wall as he surveyed the complex through binoculars. The factory was heavily guarded, with patrols moving in regular intervals. But Adamu had already identified a weakness, a gap in the patrol's timing that would give them just enough time to slip through undetected. "Here's the plan," Adamu whispered, gathering his team around him. "We've got a window of about 30 seconds between patrols. We'll split into two groups. Alpha will create a diversion on the west side, while Bravo breaches the east entrance. Once we're inside, we'll rendezvous and move on the artillery positions. Stay low, stay quiet, and don't engage unless absolutely necessary. We need to hit them fast and hard." The soldiers nodded, their faces set in grim determination. They knew what was at stake, and they trusted Adamu's leadership. "Move out," Adamu ordered. The team sprang into action, moving like shadows through the debris. Alpha team headed for the west side of the complex, while Bravo, led by Adamu, made the way to the east entrance. The tension was palpable, every second stretching into eternity as they waited for the right moment to strike. Adamu watched the patrols closely, counting down in his head. 5, 4, 3, 2. "Now," he hissed, and the teams burst into motion. Alpha team opened fire on the west side, the sudden barrage of gunfire and explosions drawing the attention of the guards. As the defenders scrambled to respond, Bravo team slipped through the gap and breached the east entrance, moving swiftly through the shadows. The interior of the factory was a maze of rusting machinery and crumbling walls. Adamu led his team with practiced precision, navigating the labyrinthine passages as they moved toward the target. The sound of gunfire echoed through the corridors, but the enemy was disoriented, their attention focused on the diversion outside. As they neared the artillery positions, Adamu held up a hand, signaling for his team to halt. He could hear the distant rumble of the cannons, the vibrations reverberating through the walls. They were close, just one more turn, and they would be at the heart of the enemy's firepower. "Prepare charges," Adamu whispered, his voice barely audible. The soldiers quickly and quietly readied the explosives, the movements fluid and efficient. They had done this 100 times before, but they knew that this mission was different. Failure meant the loss of Abuja, the loss of everything they had fought for. Adamu took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He signaled for the team to move forward, and they rounded the final corner, coming face to face with the enemy's artillery. The cannons were massive, the barrels still hot from the constant bombardment. Kalu's troops were scrambling to respond to the attack, but they were caught off guard by the sudden appearance of Bravo team. For a split second, the two groups stared at each other in shocked silence, then all hell broke loose. Adamu reacted first, firing a burst from his rifle that took down the nearest enemy soldier. "Go, go," he shouted, and his team sprang into action. They moved with deadly precision, cutting through the disoriented enemy forces with practiced ease. The sound of gunfire filled the air as the soldiers of Bravo team fanned out, targeting the artillery operators and any guards that tried to stand in the way. "Set the charges," Adamu ordered over the din, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Two soldiers, explosives experts, rushed forward and began planting charges on the massive cannons. The hands moved quickly but carefully, securing the charges at critical points where the explosions would do the most damage. Meanwhile, the rest of the team provided cover, picking off any enemies who attempted to stop them. The enemy forces were still in disarray, struggling to mount a coordinated defense against the sudden assault. Kalu's troops had been caught completely off guard, and it was clear they hadn't expected an attack on the supposedly secure position. Adamu knew they only had moments before the enemy regrouped, moments that would determine the success or failure of the mission. As the last of the charges were set, Adamu surveyed the battlefield, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The enemy was starting to recover from the initial shock, more soldiers flooding into the factory from other parts of the complex. They were rallying around the artillery positions, determined to protect the cannons that had been wreaking havoc on Abuja. "We're out of time," one of the explosives experts called out. "Charges are set." Adamu nodded. "Fall back, now." Bravo team began to retreat, moving quickly but carefully through the maze of machinery and rubble. They fired sporadically to keep the enemy at bay as they made the way back toward the east entrance, where they had breached the factory. The air was thick with dust and smoke, the sound of gunfire punctuated by the shouts of soldiers. As they reached the relative safety of the entrance, Adamu paused, waiting for the last of his team to clear the blast zone. The enemy was close behind them, and he could see the determination in their eyes. They knew what was at stake, and they were willing to fight to the last man to save their artillery. But Adamu had no intention of letting them win. "Detonate the charges," he ordered into his radio, his voice calm despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. The explosives experts didn't hesitate. With a single press of a button, the charges ignited in a deafening explosion that rocked the entire factory. The ground shook beneath them as the cannons were ripped apart, the force of the blast sending a shockwave through the complex. Flames and debris shot into the air, the remnants of the artillery reduced to smoldering wreckage. The soldiers of Bravo team shielded themselves from the blast, feeling the heat of the explosion even from a distance. When the dust began to settle, they could see the devastation they had wrought. Kalu's prized artillery was nothing more than twisted metal and smoking ruins. "Mission accomplished," Adamu muttered to himself, allowing a small smile to tug at the corners of his mouth. But there was no time to celebrate. The enemy was still out there, and they would be coming for blood. Adamu quickly rallied his team, ensuring that everyone was accounted for and ready to move. They needed to get out of the factory and back to friendly lines before Kalu's forces could regroup and retaliate. "Let's move," Adamu barked, leading his team back through the corridors they had navigated earlier. The factory was now a death trap, and they had to escape before the enemy realized what had happened. Bravo team moved quickly, the footsteps echoing through the abandoned halls as they retraced the path to the east entrance. As they emerged from the factory, the dawn light illuminated the devastation they had left behind. The once formidable artillery pieces that had pounded Abuja for days were now silent, reduced to little more than scrap metal. Adamu felt a surge of triumph. This was a significant blow to Kalu's forces, one that would buy Joshua Odum and the defenders of Abuja precious time. But Adamu knew they weren't safe yet. They still had to make it back to the city, and the enemy would be out for revenge. They needed to stay alert and keep moving. Bravo team moved swiftly through the wreckage-strewn streets, heading back toward the city. The sounds of battle still echoed in the distance, but for now, the immediate danger had passed. They kept the pace steady, wary of any signs of pursuit. "How far to the rendezvous point?" Adamu asked one of his soldiers, who was checking the position on a handheld GPS. "About 2 clicks, sir," the soldier replied. "We should be able to reach it without running into any major enemy forces." Adamu nodded, satisfied. They had done what they came to do, now they just needed to get home. Setting: the presidential villa, Abuja. Back at the presidential villa, Joshua Odum was receiving updates on the mission. The relief in the command center was palpable when word came through that Bravo team had successfully completed their objective. The news sent a wave of hope through the exhausted defenders of Abuja, hope that maybe, just maybe, they could turn the tide of this battle. Lieutenant Adamu's team took out the artillery, Colonel Hassan reported, his voice tinged with satisfaction. "Kalu's forces are in disarray. We've got a window of opportunity to reinforce our positions and regroup." Joshua allowed himself a moment of relief, but he knew they couldn't rest on the laurels. "Good work. Let's use this time wisely. Get our supply lines secured, and see if we can get some reinforcements from the north. We need to capitalize on this victory before Kalu can recover." Adeora, who had been monitoring the situation closely, stepped forward. This was a critical blow to Kalu's offensive. But we need to be prepared for his next move. He won't take this setback lightly. Joshua nodded, his mind already racing with the possibilities. Agreed. We can't afford to underestimate him. Kalu is dangerous when he's cornered, and he's still got plenty of resources at his disposal. As the officers moved to carry out Joshua's orders, he took a moment to gather his thoughts. The battle for Abuja was far from over, but for the first time in days, he felt that they had a fighting chance. Kalu had thrown everything he had at them, and they had not only survived, they had struck back. But Joshua knew better than to become complacent. Kalu was a ruthless opponent, and the general's thirst for power would not be easily quenched. The battle would continue, and the fate of Nigeria still hung in the balance. Joshua steeled himself for what lay ahead. He was ready to fight, ready to lead his people through the storm. The rise of a dictator could only be stopped with relentless courage, and Joshua Odum was prepared to give everything he had to that cause. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows of the command center, Joshua Odum felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road to victory would be long and hard, but with each passing day, they were getting closer to reclaiming the country. The battle for Abuja, and for Nigeria, was far from over. But Joshua was determined to see it through to the end. They had drawn a line in the sand, and now, they would defend it with everything they had. For freedom, for justice, for Nigeria.